Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club that takes place on the first Tuesday of every month. Our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome Lead Dev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'm the moderator of Bookmarked. I am a former COO of a scaling startup and executive coach and a leadership consultant. My specialty is tech leaders, and you can find me on Twitter with my name. Today, we'll be talking about dynamic reteaming, the art and wisdom of changing teams. If you have questions for Heidi, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Heidi Helfand. Oh, I hope I didn't mess that up. Is it Helfand? Close enough.
That's perfect.
Cool.
Yeah.
Heidi Helfand is author of the book Dynamic Reteaming. She coaches software development teams using practical people-focused techniques with the goal of building resilient organizations as they double and triple in size. Heidi is currently VP of Engineering at Kin Insurance, which offers affordable coverage to homeowners in catastrophe-prone regions. Her 20-plus career in SaaS launched Procore Technologies and AppFolio to IPO and Expert City to acquisition by Citrix. She was on the original development team that built GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar. Heidi is based in Southern California. So good to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Suzan. Thanks.
Yeah. So how did this book come about?
Yeah, I think I love reading. You know, you can see the books behind me, and I specifically read to solve problems that I face as a practitioner. I've been working in software companies for a while now, and I remember reading a lot about teams. A lot of the books that I have here about team dynamics and communication, other things like that, org design, and I was always reading the wisdom that said the best teams are the ones that maybe change infrequently, they're stable, they're maybe more static. And at one point in my career, I had a conversation with some friends, and I was looking back and I was like, wait a minute, we weren't doing it wrong at these companies that tripled in size. We were building successful products. People were using them, loving them. The companies were thriving. They are still thriving, and we changed a lot. And so I became curious about this topic, and I really wrote the book because I wanted to prove the point that teams evolve and change. It's a natural occurrence. So let's look there. Let's look at that lens and try, instead of trying to control everything and keep everything the same, because that's really, you know, it's more productive to focus over here and like enable changes and work with it. And, you know, things that don't need to change, but let's look at the lens of evolving teams. So.
I love that. Well, so when we think about reteaming, I guess we'll just talk real quickly, like just so we're on the same page. What do you mean by the word reteaming? You know, just so that everybody who hasn't read the book is maybe clear about that, you know.
Yeah. And, you know, so reteaming is a common noun, like you can find it in the dictionary. You know, it's really about changing teams or changing the team composition. If you Google just reteaming, you'll see that it's used a lot in the field of like movies. You know, these two are reteaming to create a new movie about this topic.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's when people are switching into a new composition, you know, and then dynamic reteaming is the kind of the two words that I put together. And that it's a little bit ambiguous because it's sort of like it implies movement and change in dynamic reteaming. It implies that that there is also a team dynamic. So it's almost like lexically ambiguous. Dynamic reteaming, you can reteam a dynamic, like you can try to initiate a change in a team dynamic, or you can dynamic reteaming is also about just kind of going with a change that's there. I wrote the book to try to explain what it was. So there's these patterns in here, and yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I want to go to the patterns. So in there, you talk about, you name 5 dynamic reteaming patterns. And I'd love to just go through each one of them so folks can kind of like a high level
Sure.
understanding. So the first one by one pattern. So what is it? And maybe what should we consider that maybe might not be obvious when we're thinking about this one?
Yeah. So in the course of writing the book, I wrote about my experiences, but then I interviewed people around the world to derive these patterns from stories, kind of like a bottoms up process. So one by one, somebody joins your team or someone leaves your team. So maybe you have a new hire that joins your team.
Yep.
Or maybe someone, switching is another one of the patterns where somebody might switch to your team. It's kind of similar. But when somebody joins your team, you're in the space of onboarding. So one of the things that I think is something that you might not think about is it's connected to the hiring process. It's like the beginning of that employee experience, from when you post something, when you invite people to apply, to when people join, and then in the end people leave for a variety of reasons. So like one thing you might not think about is like, all right, you're starting an experience, an employee experience, and you could think about that also in terms of the software you're building in that user experience. So you're building software, but you're also building your company. So that kind of layer is, I think, pretty interesting. And you also, when you onboard someone, depending on who they are and what their role is, you might want to take different approaches. Let's say you have a director starting versus a product manager starting. Maybe you have them read different material, meet with different people, so you customize it.
Yeah, I think what I hear in there is like being conscious about that there's a dynamic there, that one person is joining, and so the composition of the team is changing, and how do we help ensure that they successfully enter that unit?
Yeah, you raise an interesting point there, because it only takes one person to change the team dynamic. And this comes from organizational relationship systems coaching, ORSC, which you may be familiar with. Suzan and I were talking about how we've done the same coach training in the past at Coaches Training Institute. And ORSC kind of came out of that. But anyway, yeah, it only takes one person to kind of shift that dynamic. Also, the other side of the one by one pattern is someone leaves your team. Maybe they go to another team or another company, that it feels different there too. And I think, we work at companies, we inhabit roles, we bring our unique personality and experiences and kind of who we are to it. We're not that paper job description, right? We're so much more than that. And so the feel changes when a new person joins or a new person leaves.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, and then another pattern, that I want to talk about is the grow and split, which is quite different than just one-on-one. So can you tell us just a quick, what is that? And then maybe what should we look out for when navigating a grow and split sort of situation?
Sure. Yeah. So grow and split is, as the name implies, a growth pattern. If your company is adding a lot of people, what you might find is that teams grow bigger, and then sometimes the work becomes unrelated. It's harder to make decisions. Your meetings are going to be longer. Maybe you had a stand up that took 10 minutes, but now since the team is so much bigger, it takes a lot longer. Planning is longer. These are signals that maybe a change would be helpful. Some teams come to this on their own, like through a retrospective, like maybe we would be more effective in delivering value at the cadence that we want, at the quality that we want, if we were to shift our composition. And so this is one, there's a lot of stories in the book that demonstrate this at different companies. And I think it's a really interesting pattern too, because sometimes people might look at a team on the outside and think, wow, they're kind of big. Shouldn't they be smaller? But that team is really effective. So teams don't need to split. Like larger teams work too, especially if they've incorporated facilitation in their meetings and in how they work together. Like you can function with a larger team. I think many people, might find that it's easier if the team is a little bit smaller, maybe 4 or 5 engineers, plus the other roles that we collaborate with on a cross-functional team. So the book, it's really describing these patterns. And the grow and split can also happen at higher levels. I've been in multiple contexts where maybe we have a group of teams together and the teams have kind of multiplied. And then we've decided at a higher level that we should switch and have a couple different divisions or domains. Maybe we focus on a couple of different domains. So this can happen at multiple levels, like the team level, the team of teams level, company levels. I was at a company where it was Appfolio, where we worked on we created another product called Secure Docs, which was kind of like a secure document storage that, so that the company grew in that way. And Secure Docs actually split off and became its own company separate from Appfolio. I think they might have shared some of the same board members, but then that company wound up getting acquired. So that was like a grow and split at a larger level. So it happens at these different levels. And that kind of concept is related to a book on the bookshelf. It's blue called Panarchy, which talks about different kind of levels. And there's an eco-cycle kind of thing in my book that is related to the book Panarchy.
Yeah, I recommend everyone that I think it's the first chapter of the book where you talk about the ecosystems is so incredible. I spent too much time. I thought, I've got to keep reading here, but it's so great. Panarchy and the whole ecosystem that you outlined.
Yeah, the eco cycle, and credit also to the Liberating Structures community and the book Liberating Structures, which is a fascinating, amazing book and website with open source patterns on how to facilitate people and groups. And liberatingstructures.com. I was introduced to the concept of an eco-cycle through Liberating Structures. They apply it to work. You can look at your work through the lens of an eco-cycle, and then they reference Panarchy as well. So
it's really great. Some really great resources. I will say your book, there are so many great resources inside the book. So for everybody, read the book and you'll find out lots of other great resources for topics, or if you're interested in this topic, like obviously we are. It's a lot of great resources. Well, it's so interesting. So you talk about the grow and split, but then there's a pattern that might seem kind of counterintuitive opposite, which is like merging, right? So that merging pattern, because there's this idea like smaller teams are better, but like when is the merging pattern, maybe is that the right choice,
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting too. And grow and split is really about the growth. What I'm learning more and more is that merging is a lot about when maybe you lose team members or your company shrinks for whatever reason. It's just been, if you look at layoffs.fyi or other things going on in the industry during the pandemic, and then we had some changes and now I'm noticing in the industry, there's some other layoffs. And when people leave, or when they leave in large numbers, you see some merging happening. You can also deliberately merge teams to form groups. Maybe it makes sense from a management perspective to have maybe some of your divisions kind of move together for kind of like leadership oversight. Sometimes there's some stories in the book about, there was a team in William Them, an engineering manager in New Zealand at a company at the time. These are all points in time, these stories, called Trade Me. And he was on some teams that merged together because the software engineers pair programmed and they were porting a system from one language to another, and they wanted more pair programming variety. So they merged a couple of teams together so that each day when they figured out who was going to pair with whom, they had a larger kind of pool of people. So that was like an interesting reason for a couple of teams to merge. Also just that general, I think, management oversight. Merging is also at the company level. Your company acquires another company, and then there's some kind of blending that happens. We can kind of see that, or your company gets acquired by another company and you're kind of merged within this other entity, and suddenly everyone has t-shirts of the new company. It's interesting. Things happen when companies merge together. I think the employee experience becomes a little bit different. There's a different kind of global identity.
Yeah. Well, and when you talk about in the book, you talk a great story too about the isolation pattern. Can you just tell a tiny bit about, what that isolation pattern means? I think many of us have experienced it, but I loved that pattern. I thought that was like a really great way to put it.
Yeah. So, sometimes for an emergency situation, maybe you have an outage and people come together and form a short-lived team like that. There's another, I'm sure I wrote about this in the book, which is a visceral experience that I had. Like the first startup that I was at, I was on a web development team and we were going to change the world because we were creating screen sharing technology, kind of like what we're using now, but many years earlier. And we
Yep.
were trying to apply this so we could see and control someone's computer from a distance. So this was Expert City. And we had created this marketplace where you could get online tech support. So you could post your question on the website. Live experts would be standing by to join on your computer to solve your problem. And it was like 99, 2000. It was a very exciting time in the world and .com, whatever. I became an interaction designer. We were working on like what the new features were going to be like. It was like super exciting, very motivating. We were all like, it was an incredible experience. But we had one little problem that people weren't buying the services. Like it wasn't working. Like
That
it wasn't
problem.
sustainable. It was like that really big problem. And I was invited to a team that was off to the side, that was isolated. The rest of the teams that were working on this old thing and a couple of other things were told, leave us alone. Let us work on this new thing. We did market validation. We wound up building a product called Go to My PC, where you could see and operate your computer from a distance. And I think through the internet, there was some other solution called PC Anywhere back in the day that was, I think, kind of similar to it, but it was like box software. But I was able to be part of this team off to the side, and we had process freedom. So the rest of the company was doing kind of old waterfall ways of working with pixel perfect mockups that would always change later, but it was like these long drawn out iterations, and we got to work differently in this team. So it was I looked back on that experience, and then another one where we were building, actually it was that SecureDocs product I was talking about at the next startup, where when building a new product, it sometimes is helpful to have that team off to the side, because the iterations that you do in discovery of what you're going to build, how you're going to build it, getting customer feedback might need to be at a faster pace than existing software teams that are working on software that is more mature, and maybe it's more of a maintenance or feature add type thing, but the cadences are, working on something at a 2-week cadence versus working on something at an hourly or a daily cadence feels completely different. It helps to have a different team off to the side and to like give that team freedom to innovate and do things differently. So that's really the isolation pattern.
Yeah, I love that. What I like about the isolation pattern too is there's almost this recognition that every team doesn't have to look the same, and that sometimes having a team that is doing completely different things is absolutely appropriate for what's going on with the business at that time.
Yeah. And there's always this tension, because I think sometimes at companies, they want each team to operate the same. Here's your Jira board, like let's all have the same columns. And it can feel like really suffocating to have to like work in these constraints. We need, as an engineering manager I work with, a senior engineering manager, Becky Hartman, always says kind of aligned autonomy, like where are we going to, where do we align and where do we diverge? But yeah, I always like the idea that teams own their process and get to determine how they work. They just need to have the ability to report out on their progress.
Yeah, that's so great. All right, one last one. Then we're going to go to some more general questions. But the last one, you kind of mentioned the switching pattern in relation to talking about one-on-one. What is switching? How is it distinct from one-on-one? One by one, excuse me.
So someone might switch from one team to the next, maybe for reasons of fulfillment, like want to learn something new, want to work with different people. I think it's completely valid to want to work on a different team and to be with different people in a different area. So it's a one person thing, kind of like one by one, but the reasons are a little bit different than like onboarding or offboarding. It's more about switching for fulfillment, or some companies also, like you can deliberately switch to share knowledge or to get knowledge, into more than one team. There's stories in here about doing that. I remember at the second startup that I was at, we had one team, it split into two. We started a third team, and some of the engineers that I work with felt a big loss. We had pair programmed and felt a big loss that now that we're in these three separate teams, wait, I can't pair with this other engineer over here on this team. And they worked out a regular rotation so that they would be able to pair with each other and still kind of keep some context. It's hard when you're a startup that gets bigger and the teams, get to 50 or more. It's like, you obviously can't have context on everything, but there's something really special about wanting to kind of keep that context as long as you can. It's kind of like a holding on, but switching kind of enables that a little bit. It's not that everybody needs to switch teams or should. It's just, I think, there are many human reasons why we might want to enable people to switch. It's like a different kind of opportunity. I like if you're starting something new and you make the hiring visible or the opportunity visible, you might find that someone over there in that team over there who maybe you weren't thinking about is ready for a switch. Everybody, we get approached by recruiters, all of us, all the time. We hear about these other opportunities, but what about the opportunities within the company? So let's kind of share what we have to enable people to extend their career within our company. That's something that I always think about. So how can we it's really tied to kind of learning and fulfillment and also kind of knowledge share.
That's great. Well, and it's so interesting. So when we think about reteaming, often it seems like managers and leaders take the lead, and not always, but we think about that. Why might managers and leaders consider involving the team rather than just taking it on themselves?
Ownership. And we could be wrong, are two short reasons. So like one, there's a story in the book about visualizing a larger scale reteaming on whiteboards and bringing people into it, bringing engineers into it to identify, actually, out of all these, let's say there were 25 teams involved in this reteaming. It's more of a kind of like reorg type situation. It could be that this team makes more sense to go over here, and here's why. That's one thing that we learned. We did this at the third company that I was at. We visualized its reteaming. I think it comprised of 80 people. It was that kind of scenario with teams of teams. We're splitting into 3 divisions, and involving the engineers helped us understand the best decisions to make. I think leaders might start discussions with each other about the next state of the org. And you might be talking about it for a month, but then you need to involve people in it so they own the change, they understand the change. There's a chapter in my book that has a guideline about, it's kind of like coming up with an FAQ when you introduce a change for input. And it's kind of like, what problem are we trying to solve? And what does the before team structure look like, the after team structure, answers to questions that we've come up with. A lot of the times the leaders need to have patience to include people. The people might not make the final decision. I like using a decision-making framework I learned from a HR people leader named Pat Waters. It's called RIDE. So RIDE, R, who's the requester of the change, I, who's able to give input on this change. It could be a wide range of people giving the input. D, who is the decider? Maybe it's this particular person that's going to make the decision. And knowing that is very helpful. And then E, who executes on the change? RIDE, Pat Waters. She's a people leader now, I think she was at Procore Technologies where I met her and was exposed to this. I've encouraged her to write about this because I think it's a very useful pattern to, we want to make, we want decision-making on reteamings to be highly visible. If I were to make a third edition of this book, I would definitely want to include the RIDE framework in there if I could. If you Google it, you probably can't find much on it because I don't think she's written about it, but I would encourage her to do so.
Yeah, that's so great. It's a great way to think about it, right? Like the communication and who's involved and allowing them to be empowered or have a say in it.
Yeah. What's the timeline for this? What other changes are needed? If it's all virtual, that's one thing. If it involves moving people's desks or to a different location, you often need to involve your facilities friends or your IT friends. But that's like kind of one case. Like there's other cases where you can create groups of teams together and enable them to organize themselves and give them that freedom to do that. We do that at my company where we have these domains with 2 or more teams, and they get to decide how they organize to tackle the work. And what I like about that is you can drive it from retrospectives. You can enable people to make more local decisions, and then you have some shared agreements on how you kind of report out. So there's a lot of I think you miss out if you don't involve people in the discussions. And I think for leaders might get impatient and feel like they have a structural change all figured out. It's time to push the button and get this going. But people usually need more time, and I think it pays off to include people as much as you can. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't. And you just have to get a change through. But ideally, people get input.
Yeah, and in the book, there's some really great examples of ways that's been done. There's some great stories. It's really you're right. It's so chock-loaded with stories. And the thing that I as I read the book, one thing that I kept thinking about, another undercurrent, is sort of, it's a lot about like reteaming. Dynamic reteaming isn't just about the structures, but it's about managing change. And, it's really that's an undercurrent. And, you mentioned one of my very favorite books, Transitions by William Bridges.
Yeah.
Yep. One of my favorite books. It's an old book, but it's such a good book. It's like a classic. I love it because it talks about sort of the process that people go through. So I wonder if you could share the philosophy for folks who don't know what that's talking about.
Yeah. So in Transitions, and this is by William Bridges, there's also a really nice audiobook of it. He talks about endings, neutral zones, and I think he calls it new beginnings. Yep. Or something like that. But when I was on a leadership team at a previous company, not the one I'm at, but a company or 2 ago, I was in this leadership team. We had a new leader come in, and our leadership team was split. And it was really, really hard for me because I was used to this team. I was used to our, being in the same stand-ups, in the same meetings. We were working through issues together, but then suddenly we got kind of reteamed. And I didn't want it to happen. I wasn't very pleased with this, but I was going along with it, right? So, but how it went down was we each had one-on-ones with the leader that we had, and then we were like split out. And I remember that I was like moved out of a Slack channel. And for me, it was like, it's kind of like if you leave a company and suddenly you don't have that community anymore, it feels like a loss. And, I heard about this book, and one of the things was like talking about the ending. And we did that. So we got that original group together. We had a consultant working with us, and we talked about working together. We appreciated each other. We talked about what it was like. This was a company that had grown a lot. And in really just talking through what we had been together, why we're making the changes, instead of just this separate one-on-one and suddenly you're split, like it helped us like get close. It helped me at least get closure to the ending. And then the neutral zone. So it's endings, neutral zones, and new begins. The neutral zone is that you're getting into that future state. You're not quite there yet. Let's say you have a new leader. In this case, we had a new leader over here. This team of people, it was some of us, then new people were coming in. It was like a new team system to get to know. And so we weren't quite in that future state yet, but we were kind of getting there. So in that kind of neutral zone, it can feel uncomfortable. It can feel uncertain. And I think, what can we do to kind of shift into that future state? So if somebody comes and let's say a team decides we're going to split into 2, we're going to use grow and split, we're going to split into 2. Doing some deliberate activities to kind of kick off those new teams, I think helps get you into that future state. So team splits, you're in that new state. Okay, who are these people? Like, get to know each other. There's great activities on the internet about like writing a user's guide to me. If you Google user's guide to me, like, what do you want to share about yourself so everyone knows? There's another activity I write about in the book from a wonderful coach, also CTI trained, same coach training that Suzan and I have. Lisa Atkins writes about an activity called Market of Skills, where people get the opportunity to share, this is what I bring to the team. These are the skills that I want you to know about. These are my interests that I want to share with you from outside of work. This is what I want to learn in the next few months. And this is what I offer to teach you. And I remember using that at one company when I was coaching a team. And we learned that our new friend that joined the team was able to take apart a motorcycle and put it back together. And then it was like, whoa, this respect was just there that it might have taken years or never to learn that this person possessed this ability. How does that relate to the job? Well, it doesn't correlate directly, but it's like this idea of trying to help this team dynamic get in the future state. What are your team agreements? How do you want to work together? How are you going to organize your work? So aligning on all of this is one thing to get in the future state. So endings, neutral zones, new beginnings. We can do deliberate activities for all of them. In that neutral zone, I think, is a great place for coaching and support, especially for leaders, for managers, for anyone that needs any additional support. It's coaching is helpful.
Yeah, well, yeah, because I always think of I think oftentimes we do endings and new beginnings, and we forget that there's this neutral zone where there's a lot of uncertainty or ambiguity and a lot of confusion, and it's like power through it, and you're in a new thing, and let's go. And it's like what I love about that, like the neutral zone, is like, how do you mark that? What are the rituals? How do you want to be with that?
Yeah. And actually, like, you could even visualize this, like you could use an online whiteboard, or if you're, in person together on the wall, like have everybody get a Post-it note. Here's your ending. Here's your new beginning. Here's your neutral zone. Write your name on the Post-it note. Where are you on that list? Because it's invisible, right? Like, especially if you have like 10 people, like, who knows, like some people are ready to move on. Like, let's stop talking about this already, Heidi. Let's move to the new thing. Like, stop it. And other people are kind of like, I'm still working it through. And like, you could be surprised. So it's the Kanban technique. We want to visualize what is and then kind of move from there. But great. I love the ideas from this book. I think it's really helped me a lot, and it applies also to he's not writing about software in here. He's writing about any kind of transition. So,
and he has a great book too about I can't remember the name of it. It's managing transitions at the organizational level too, when companies are going through it, which is also instructive too. So yeah, big fan, huge fan of
that one. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So a lot of it's about managing change. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions from that we've had come up. So can you touch on how dynamic reteaming principles reconciles with the recommendations from team topologies for long-lived stream-aligned teams?
Yeah. So I really, so team topologies, love the book. I think it's a specific solution, right?
Yep.
So it's kind of like there's enabling teams, there's streamlined teams, complicated subsystems teams, et cetera. And it could be a way for you to look at your teams today and determine a future design, and it guides that. So how do you get from the current state to the future state is kind of, some ideas in my book. That's where they come in, kind of that human layer and getting from the current to the future. So I really see team topologies as that specific solution. And I love especially the concept of enabling teams. And I'm not saying all your teams need to be short-lived. I'm not saying all your teams need to change tomorrow. There could be a very good reason why you want one team to stay together longer. But then what's going to happen is time's going to pass. Somebody's going to leave your team, or somebody's going to join it. And so like, it's going to evolve naturally anyway. Right. But if you have the goal to try to keep the team together, I'm not stopping you from that. And I'm not saying bust up all your teams. Like, some of my talks have caused reorgs, and that's not my goal. I'm sharing what I've learned as a practitioner in this book with these 5 patterns. This is not, I don't have any workshop to sell or something to implement. This is like, it's almost like an anthropology of
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that it's really in the title of the book, right? Dynamic, which is, I think, a nod to like these things are always changing. As you said, organically, things are changing. And it's sort of like noticing and being conscious about how do we want to be with the changes that are happening, that organically happen in an organization, which is a living, breathing entity. It's never static.
Yeah. And, there's going to be a lot happening at once. That's the other thing with these patterns. You might have somebody joining a team here, and then a team splits over here. And then over here, you have two teams merging. And the larger the organization you have, like that's, essentially that kind of dynamic reteaming. There's a lot going on. Some you're going to see, some you're not going to see. If you notice all of it, you might find it to be like this tree in the wind, and some of the branches are falling off, and suddenly it hails, and you might, it is living and breathing. It's this larger kind of system that's part of this other system. It's all connected.
Yeah, it's like that ecosystem, eco cycle. I think in the beginning of the book. Read that pattern, read that section, everybody. It's so good.
I really wish it were so easy that we could have forming, storming, norming, performing, a team come together. It stays together. Yeah. There's never any change, and it's like, all of that, but just life happens. People come and go. Suddenly you have to change your strategy, and people are requested to work on something different. Nothing lasts. And that's why I think it's like, if you have a really amazing team situation now, celebrate it, be with your team, like appreciate it, because things just change. They just do. It's part of nature. Things evolve and change. Yeah. And sometimes somebody's going to come and try to catalyze a change, or maybe you're going to try to do it within your team, and that's fine too. But that's more of the constant. So
that's so great. All right, I have two more audience questions, and I'm going to end with one. So are there any particular risks to using the isolation pattern when it comes out of operating in that pattern?
Yes, there are risks. If you have a team that goes to the side, builds a feature, leaves, goes somewhere else, like who's going to maintain it? Like everything needs kind of care and planning. So I think that's a risk. I've seen people run off fast, partner with sales in a previous company, partner with sales and build this highly requested feature that wasn't on the roadmap, wasn't on their list of priorities, but they were early employees that were working together, and like suddenly they did this thing. And then they didn't make agreements with the people that own certain areas of the code base, and kind of left something for other people to kind of maintain and clean up. That is not a good thing to do. You want to work out your agreements across teams before you run fast and do something. Like we're working in these systems where we have existing code, and we need to be good partners with each other. So I think that's kind of an anti-pattern. Each of these patterns have anti-patterns. I think, if people come together in isolation to work on things, something else is going to be left behind. Talking about that is really important.
Yeah, it's so great. Okay. Let's see. So my team is about to go through a complete reteaming, which for us means we're both splitting and merging teams to be less functionally focused. Unfortunately, we'll also be working on our existing projects while that transition is happening. What are your maybe top 2 or 3 pieces of advice on how to make a transition like this as smooth as possible?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is like, write that FAQ memo. Why? What problems are we trying to solve by having this reteaming? What does it look like today? What does it look like in the future? So a visual, like you can do it with one of these online whiteboards like Mural or Miro. Let's say, this is the current state of the team. This is a future state. Is anyone getting a new manager? That's a big deal. Like if someone changes managers, that's a really big deal. Is that happening? What's the timeline for these changes? It's highly disruptive to be expected to work through everything that you're doing and also concurrently work on these changes. So like, what is that balance like? What questions do you think might come up in this change? I think the planning team can seed an FAQ, and then start having meetings with people to identify other things that you missed, especially if it's with a large amount of people. You probably, the planning group likely might have missed some things. So there's a chapter in my book about this, or you can send me a message on LinkedIn. So.
Yep, that's so great. All right, I'm going to take one last audience question.
Okay.
So with all kind of change, leadership stability can become tricky. You may have 4 different leaders in less than a year. This translates into a very little personal growth and can be exhausting. How would you suggest to avoid or handle these situations while reteaming?
You know, it is disruptive to have a new leader. It is disruptive to have a new manager, senior manager, director, VP, whatever. We all need to take responsibility for our own careers. Everyone, like, what do you want to learn in the next 3 months? Where do you want to go? Each of us can take responsibility to have our own individual development plans. Like, you can be deliberate about what books you read, what languages you learn. We need to have ownership over that. This doesn't come for free. You're going to have different experiences with different managers who might be more focused on career growth. Some might not even mention it. Your mileage may vary, but we each need to be responsible for our own career progressions. If you have a one-on-one with someone, you want to have a doc with your accomplishments, what you want to talk about, what your questions are. This can be a long-lived doc that can go from manager to manager. But we each need to kind of take responsibility for getting that together. It's something that I do for myself as well. I started doing this a few years ago, that you got to tell the story of yourself to these new people, because they're not necessarily going to get it. I've seen great managers who have left companies that have written and put in like the tracking system or put in a shared doc, suggestions for the new manager or what they want you to know about the direct reports. That's been helpful, but not everybody does that, right? So we really need to always be able to tell the story of ourselves, as well as what do we want to do? Where do we want to go? How do we want to grow? So that's each of our responsibilities.
I love that. I do want to ask one last quick question, because I'm really interested. You're talking about career progression. Like, you wrote this book originally as a director, and now you're in a VP role. And I'm curious, anything about what you've learned or how your perspective may have shifted as you've sort of grown yourself?
Yeah. I've been kicking around the idea of like a leader's guide to dynamic reteaming, or writing about the topic from this vantage point. Because I think whatever place we sit in an org, we have a specific lens. And, they're like one of the key things that I've learned in my role is that topic of patience, especially if you're privy to information before a lot of other people. You have to understand when people join the storyline, when people join the idea, and that they haven't been talking about it for a month like you have. So you have to have patience with people and like let things ideally kind of roll out, accordingly. Should it be slowly? I don't know. It depends on what it is. Some things need to happen quickly. But yeah, I think, I've been in this role now for over a year. So I see the patterns in the same way. I think also with, with privilege comes, responsibility. So, responsible reteaming and being respectful and including people is paramount.
Well, I would read that book if you decide to write it, but no pressure. So thank you for joining us during this session. Our next session will be on October 4th, where we'll be speaking with LeMay Nasri on her book. And on November 1st, we will be talking with Tanya Riley about their book, The Staff Engineer's Path. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us.